The spring of 1852 came to central Georgia like a fever that wouldn't break. Rains lingered beyond reason, turning the red roads that laced Hancock County into clay-ribboned rivers and pinning wagons axle-deep in the mire. The delay gnawed at planters' nerves. Cottonseed sat bagged and silent, while ledgers muttered in candlelight. Most men counted days like dollars, and dollars like absolution. Edmund Rutled counted something else, the years he had left, to tether his name to the soil. He had built Clearwater Plantation, the way certain men build reputations patiently, without mercy, and with an eye for how appearances do the heaviest lifting. He was not of the old blood, but he wore its clothes. He had acquired neighbors the way a coastal tide acquires shells, by washing against their debts until the edges came loose. His wife, Anne, had died 3 winters earlier, and with her the pretense that Edmund's heart was ever softened by anything but calculation. In her absence, he moved through the house the way a surveyor moves across a field, assessing, measuring, confirming that all lines meet at the corners he intended. There were 3 daughters, Catherine at 22 with her quiet, bookish poise, Margaret at 20 with ledgers for lullabies and an unflinching way of looking at facts, Elizabeth at 18 with watercolors and a talent for seeing more than she would say. They had the education of Charleston salons and the isolation of a house built to echo only one voice. Edmund admired their polish and dismissed their wishes. Daughters, he believed, were the slender bridges by which a man's name crossed into other families and disappeared. He feared vanishing more than he feared God. When the rain stalled the planting, Edmund called the delay an opportunity and put his best grey mare to the red road for Atlanta. He did not intend to waste time with talk of seed drills and manure rates. He intended to find an idea large enough to carry his name beyond the small tyrannies of acreage and into the long after. The Southern Agricultural Convention, held beneath chandeliers in a hotel that pretended to be a palace, offered him exactly what he sought, a room thick with men determined to make nature obey. It was on the second evening, under a drift of cigar smoke and the glassy murmur of whiskey, that a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles stepped to the podium and introduced himself as Dr. Nathaniel Peaton of the College of Charleston. He was the kind of speaker who believed conviction is the same thing as proof. He spoke of European journals and new thinking about heredity. He drew neat lines from sire to colt, from cow to calf, from seed to stalk, and told the room that blood is a ledger nature keeps in the body. Selective pairing, he said, makes better horses, better cattle, stronger offspring, quicker minds. Traits you can plan like a planting schedule. The words slid from livestock towards something unsaid but understood. No one coughed the word people. No one needed to. Edmund listened with the attention of a man who hears a map unfolding. Around him, some men nodded gravely, some frowned at the impropriety skulking beneath the lecture, and some, the most dangerous sort, grew very quiet. Peaton described hybrid vigor, the notion that crossing distinct lines could yield offspring that outmatched either parent. He called it theory, and smiled like a man offering a key he swore he hadn't tried in any forbidden door. After the applause thinned, Edmund found Peaton at the bar. The doctor's enthusiasm, warmed by bourbon, loosened into specifics. Planters near Charleston, pairing specimens with success. Records that could be read if one knew which drawers to open and which names to omit. The necessity of control, no random coupling. Only designed unions with results tallied like yields. Think like a horse breeder. Peaton said, think like a scientist. He said the last word as if it allowed him to walk above the mud. Edmund did not smile. He did not need to. While other men sensed a moral precipice, he sensed a staircase leading down to a locked room where a man like him could work without interruption. He pictured it lineage treated as a material, bodies, white and black, arranged like figures in a proof. He felt the cold such ideas require, and it felt like clarity. On the ride back to Clearwater, the roads had begun to harden. The wagon ruts still held rainwater like dull mirrors. Edmund watched the fields he owned unspool beneath his mare's hooves and thought of lines and names and how law could be made to stand on one leg if a man held it steady. He thought of his daughters not as people, but as the last fragile uprights of a bridge that would otherwise collapse. He thought of the enslaved men in his fields the way Peyton had taught him to, as traits that could be sorted, combined, optimized. He did not imagine the screams. He imagined the results. Clearwater received him like a machine accepts its operator without sentiment. The main house rose from its hill, whitewashed brick pretending to be purity, columns pretending to be order. The creek along the eastern boundary whispered its name through the reeds. Edmund rode the perimeter and took inventory not of what he had, but of what he needed: compliance from the courts, silence from a physician, a man among the enslaved whose strength and intelligence could make the arithmetic sing. He found his eyes drawn, as they often were, to Samuel, 31, broad-shouldered, a fraction over 6'3", born on Clearwater, when Edmund's uncle still owned the place. Samuel moved like a man who knew exactly how much space his body occupied in the world. He had a habit of looking at the sky before storms and then reorganizing the day's work without being told. The irrigation ditch that saved half the lower field last year had been his idea. Edmund had tolerated Samuel's literacy the way you tolerate an unwanted draft. You can't see it, but you can feel it move the curtains. He had kept Samuel unmarried for years, under a pretext about work needs. But the truth was simpler. Certain assets are more useful when left unspent. Now the usefulness took on an audacious shape. Edmund watched Samuel lift a bale one-handed and felt the click of a gear he had been turning since Atlanta. Strength, intelligence, self-possession, all the traits a legacy might require if you believed people could be engineered into certainty. The rest would depend on paperwork and the silence money buys. That night, Edmund lit a lamp in his study and opened a leather-bound journal that did not appear on any inventory. He did not record cotton yields. He drew columns labeled with traits. He wrote phrases like line consolidation and issue permanency, as if these were weather. His pen paused over the page where the plan stepped from thought to language. You could almost hear the house lean in to listen. He would need a judge, one who understood that law is like a fence. What matters is not where it runs, but who holds the deed to the land on either side. He knew exactly whom to call Horace Ketchum, the elderly courthouse fixture whose rulings and investments had always arrived in the same place. He would need a doctor, someone competent enough to sign what needed signing and indebted enough to forget what conscience tried to say. He knew such a man. 2. Leonard Strickland of Augusta, who owed more than he could ever repay at any table that used cards. Most of all, he would need a story, not the true one. The true one could never be told. He would need the kind of story men like him tell each other when bad things happen to the right people. An unfortunate incident, an assault, a delicate condition, words that close doors, words that turn ears to stone, words that protect daughters by erasing them. It was late when Edmund capped his ink. The house had gone quiet. In another wing, 3 young women slept uneasily through a heat that had never quite learned how to leave. On the far edge of the yard, Samuel finished mending a broken gate and stood for a moment with his hands on the top rail, breathing the earth as if it might say something back. No one in the dark could feel the line drawn between them tightened to a wire. At breakfast, Edmund was cordial. He complimented Catherine's French translation, admired Margaret's neat row of figures in the plantation account book, asked Elizabeth if the creek's light took paint well in the afternoon. He was the image of a father watchful, invested, unassailable. By noon he had sent a note to Judge Ketchum, requesting a private dinner. By sundown, he had instructed the overseer to keep Samuel on work near the main yard for the next several weeks, easier to find him. Edmund said mildly, as if efficiency were the only god he served. The rains finally relented. Planting began in long, back-breaking shifts under skies that felt wrung out. Men sang in low voices to pace their bodies. Women moved like metronomes between kitchen, nursery, and field. A rhythm returned to Clearwater, but it was not the old one. A new tempo tapped steadily beneath the visible work, the pulse of a scheme assembling itself with the ruthless calm of a machine designed by a man who believed his reflection in a lamp chimney counted as history. It is a comfort to think that horror announces itself with a scream. At Clearwater, It arrived as ordinary business, a letter to a judge, an invitation to a physician, a line in a journal that turned human lives into variables. No dogs barked, no plate shattered. The house breathed in, and Edmund decided what it would exhale. He rode the fence line once more that week and stopped where the creek narrowed and bent east. A good deep place if a man were inclined to hide anything he didn't care to face again. He marked it in his mind and turned the mare toward the house. He had guests to entertain and a future to author. In the chandelier light of his study that night, he rehearsed sentences until they sounded like inevitabilities. When he finally blew out the lamp, the room went dark in a way that felt chosen. The next day, a buggy rattled up the drive. The driver tipped his hat as servants opened the door. On the parlor mantel, a clock ticked steadily, counting off the seconds between intention and first act. Edmund adjusted his cuffs and told the butler to bring the judge to the study. The wire pulled taut. Somewhere on the property, a bird startled and lifted off the fence rail, beating the air with a panic it did not understand. Clearwater held its breath. The experiment was about to begin. The dinner with Judge Horace Ketchum began with a roast duck and ended with a conspiracy. Ketchum was 71 years old and carried himself like the law had become part of his spine, rigid, unbending, and quietly decaying. He'd been the county's legal conscience for 4 decades, which meant he'd learned precisely how to silence that conscience when the right man asked politely enough. Edmund knew the tone to use. He never begged. He invited. After dessert, the 2 men retired to the study. The brandy decanter glowed amber under the lamplight. Edmund let silence stretch until it had the density of smoke, then said, as if idly, "Judge, I've been studying cases involving inheritance, especially those concerning mixed blood." Ketchum's brow furrowed, but curiosity tugged him forward. "Curious legal ground," he said. "Also quite settled." "Precisely," Edmund replied, swirling his glass. "And that's what makes it so useful." The conversation that followed might have sounded, to a casual ear, like an academic debate. To anyone listening more closely, it was a blueprint for sin, written in legalese. Edmund guided the topic with the precision of a surgeon. "What if," he asked, "a man could produce heirs who carried his blood but had no lawful claim to his estate, children bound by nature but barred by law? Could they," he wondered, "be considered property?" Ketchum's lips tightened, but greed pried them open again. "Technically, yes, so long as the law recognizes them as belonging to the enslaved class." The judge's curiosity became calculation. Edmund's voice softened to a conspiratorial murmur. He spoke of controlled pairings, of bloodlines refined. He avoided naming who or what he meant. He didn't have to. Finally, Ketchum asked, his tone careful, "You're speaking theoretically?" "Of course," Edmund smiled. "Of course." The judge's glass clinked softly on the table. "Then you'll need protection documentation that suggests something else entirely. Should questions arise." He outlined it like a man dictating a will, false affidavits of assault, medical statements describing fabricated injuries, signatures from the daughters attesting to coercion by the enslaved man, a paper world where guilt could be inverted at will. Edmund listened as though taking dictation from the devil, and when the judge finished, he said only, "You'll be compensated for your discretion." The judge's silence was assent. The following week, Edmund summoned Dr. Leonard Strickland. Strickland was 42, competent in his work, but hollow-eyed from debts that followed him like carrion birds. He arrived expecting to examine slaves with fever. He left with a bargain that would bury what was left of his soul. Edmund poured him wine and spoke in the same measured tone he used when discussing crop yields. He introduced his idea as an improvement program, a scientific pairing designed to produce stronger, more intelligent laborers. Strickland blinked, unsure if he'd misheard. "Arranged pairings?" he asked cautiously. "Precisely," Edmund said. "I'll need you to perform examinations, keep records, certify the health of all involved. That's highly irregular. Sire, so is paying $500 above your annual fee." The doctor hesitated, Edmund watched the arithmetic of fear and debt play across his face. Then he added the final weight. I also understand your debts in Augusta amount to, he named the sum exactly, down to the last cent. Strickland's fork froze mid-air. How did you? It doesn't matter. Edmund said, I can have them cleared by month's end. You'll continue your work here in peace. Strickland set the fork down. And if I decline, then I imagine your creditors will not be as forgiving as I am. He said it kindly, which made it worse. By the time dessert was cleared, Strickland had agreed to assist in a confidential family matter. The next morning, Edmund sent letters, one to his banker, one to Ketchum, confirming that the gears of obligation were now engaged and oiled with debt and silence. That night, Edmund wrote in his hidden journal, the structure is sound. Law, medicine, and legacy, 3 pillars. All must remain invisible until the foundation is complete. He began listing names, tres, and possible outcomes, the way a breeder might record lineage. In the margins, he noted, must disguise purpose through illness, isolation justified as medical necessity. He was drafting the future like a man drafting a will, except the inheritors were not yet born, and the cost would be paid in horror. Weeks turned to a thick June heat. The fields hummed with cicadas, and the house at Clearwater became the center of a quiet, gathering storm. The 3 daughters noticed their father's temper sharpened, his footsteps heavier. Servants avoided his gaze. Margaret once found him burning papers in the study fireplace, and when she asked about the smoke, he told her it was old business records. He had begun to see everything his daughters, Samuel, the doctor, the judge as instruments in a single composition. Each note had to strike exactly on time, or the melody of control would falter. Late one night, Edmund opened his desk drawer and unfolded a piece of parchment bearing Judge Ketchum's familiar, looping signature. It was the first affidavit, a sample. Ketchum had called it written in cautious but unmistakable language. Should any complaint arise regarding improper relations within the household of Mr. E. Rutled, said, complaint shall be understood as arising from delusions or feminine distress, and all legal standing shall be void. Edmund read it twice. It was not only protection, it was permission. The next morning he walked the fields. The air shimmered above the rows of young cotton. Samuel was there, shirt damp with sweat, his movements economical, his expression distant. Edmund watched him with an intensity that made the overseer uneasy. When Samuel paused to drink from a gourd, Edmund saw not a man but a key muscle, intellect, and obedience forged under heat and habit. He spoke almost gently when he approached. You've done fine work this season. Samuel, thank you. Sire, tell me, have you ever wished for more than this? Samuel hesitated. Questions from masters were rarely gifts. I wish only to do what's required. Sire, Edmund smiled faintly. Good. A man who knows duty can be trusted with opportunity. Samuel didn't understand the meaning, but he felt its weight. When Edmund walked away, the overseer asked if something was wrong. Edmund only said, No, Potter, quite the opposite. I believe we're about to make history. That evening, thunder rolled distantly over the pine hills. Edmund stood on the veranda, watching lightning crawl across the horizon. His reflection flickered in the glass door beside him, a man convinced he had seen the future and mistaken it for destiny. Inside, his daughters played a soft melody on the parlor piano, unaware of how near the walls were beginning to close. The song drifted out onto the veranda, bright and fragile, and for a moment Edmund almost faltered. The music reminded him of his wife, of gentler ambitions. Then a gust of wind blew through, and the melody thinned, lost beneath the rumble of an approaching storm. He turned back toward his study, where Judge Ketchum's letter lay open on the desk. A single candle burned low, the wax forming small white tombs along its base. Edmund dipped his pen and wrote one final line in his journal for the night. Tomorrow I shall make the proposal. They will resist, but necessity is stronger than sentiment. Legacy de mon sacrifice. Outside, the storm broke over Clearwater, rain lashing the veranda railings. The wind rattled the shutters like something trying to get in or perhaps trying to get out. And in the morning, when the air smelled of wet earth and the sky had gone a washed-out grey, Edmund rose before dawn, shaved carefully, and prepared to deliver the plan that would make him immortal in all the worst ways. The morning of May 15th, Itin Babe Wushar, dawned heavy and airless, the kind of Georgia heat that pressed down like a hand on the back of your neck. Inside Clearwater Plantation, the curtains were drawn against the sun. Dust floated in the still air of Edmund's study, as though even the house understood that something irreversible was about to begin. Judge Horace Ketchum arrived precisely at noon. His carriage creaked up the long drive, the wheels crunching on gravel that glittered like mica. Edmund met him at the door himself, no servants this time. The meeting required privacy. They moved into the study, where the shutters were closed tight and a single decanter of brandy waited on the desk. Ketchum lowered himself into the leather chair, already perspiring through his linen collar. "I've drafted what we discussed," Edmund said without preamble. He laid out the papers like cards in a gambler's confidence spread. Affidavits, pre-signed depositions. Each one states that if scandal ever arises within my household, God forbid there exists, proof that any impropriety originated not from the family, but from coercion by one of the enslaved. Ketchum adjusted his spectacles and read. His eyes flickered as he took in the signatures, blank spaces labeled Catherine, Margaret, Elizabeth. "You plan to have them sign these?" he asked. "In time," Edmund said smoothly. "It will be precautionary. Protection against rumors. Young women are fragile creatures, easily misled or mistaken. I can ensure their cooperation." Ketchum's lips tightened. These documents would stand in court barely, but they would stand. "Just be certain your daughters never speak to anyone who might encourage their hysteria." Edmund poured the brandy. "That," he said, handing over the glass, "will not be a problem." The two men toasted without looking at each other. One drank for money, the other drank for immortality. 3 days later, Edmund set about binding the second strand of his conspiracy, the doctor. Dr. Leonard Strickland arrived from Augusta under the impression he was to perform routine medical examinations for the plantation's workforce. His buggy rattled over the long bridge at Clearwater Creek, past the shimmering fields where enslaved men worked in disciplined silence. He'd been here many times before, but something in the air now felt altered. The overseers stood straighter. The atmosphere carried an unfamiliar tension, like the moment before a storm breaks. Edmund greeted him with rare cordiality, ushering him into the dining room where cold ham and sweet tea waited on the sideboard. "You've been busy, Doctor," Edmund said lightly as they sat. "And yet, somehow, you found time for cards." Strickland froze, the fork halfway to his mouth. "I beg your pardon," Edmund smiled without warmth. "Augusta is a small world. Word travels quickly. I understand certain debts have become burdensome." The doctor set the fork down. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you are," Edmund replied, "and I think you'll agree that a man's talents are wasted when he's preoccupied with creditors." He reached into his desk and withdrew an envelope. It was thick, too thick. "These are receipts of payment. Your accounts at the Augusta Bank and the firm of M. Haynes Co. have been cleared as of this morning. Your reputation restored. You owe me nothing except discretion and cooperation." Strickland's throat worked silently as he looked at the envelope. "What exactly are you asking of me?" Edmund folded his hands. "A project, scientific in nature. You'll be recording certain hereditary outcomes. Selective pairings designed to strengthen the lineage of my estate." Strickland blinked, unsure whether to laugh or leave. "You're breeding slaves." Then, Edmund's eyes narrowed. "Breeding is for animals. Doctor, I prefer the term refinement. This is not about increasing numbers, it's about perfecting them. Intelligence, strength, obedience, all in proper measure." "And your daughters?" Strickland asked quietly. "You mentioned them in your letter." "They are essential to the process." The doctor's face went pale. "Mr. Rutled, you can't mean." "I mean precisely what I say. Edmund's tone remained calm, businesslike. Each of my daughters will bear one child, conceived through careful pairing. The father will be selected for genetic superiority. Strickland pushed his chair back. That's good God. That's monstrous. Edmund didn't flinch. What's monstrous is wasting potential. Think of the science. Doctor, the combination of intelligence and fortitude, the hybrid vigor of cross-bloodlines. I've read your own papers. You once praised agricultural crossbreeding. Surely you grasp the principle. That was livestock. Strickland hissed. And this is the future. Edmund countered. If you cooperate, your financial troubles vanish forever. If not, well, debts have a way of returning when left unattended. The room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. Strickland stared at the amber liquid in his glass. He saw, with dreadful clarity, the crossroads before him. One path led to ruin, the other to complicity. He drank, and when he set the glass down, the decision was made. By the first week of June, Clearwater had become a fortress of secrecy. The judge's legal protections were in place. The doctor's medical duties were defined. Edmund's notes in his hidden ledger grew dense with calculations, gestation, timelines, bloodline probabilities, even speculative temperament charts. At night, he sat in his study and reread Dr. Peaton's words from the convention pamphlet, "The farmer who understands heredity commands the future." He underlined commands. In another part of the house, his daughters began to sense a gathering dread they couldn't name. Margaret noticed their father's increasing absences at dinner. Catherine found the servants whispering about letters arriving from the courthouse and leaving with sealed replies. Elizabeth, the youngest, claimed she heard footsteps outside her door long after midnight. Pausing, then retreating down the hall. When Catherine mentioned this over tea one morning, Edmund's expression turned to polished stone. "My dear, imagination is a disease in women," he said. "It robs you of reason. You do well to discipline it." That afternoon, he dismissed 2 maids and reassigned their duties without explanation. Every window on the second floor was fitted with an exterior lock. On June 8th, Edmund hosted what he called a family conference. The daughters arrived in the parlor expecting discussion of finances or marriage prospects. They found instead the judge and the doctor seated with their father by the fireplace, papers spread across the table. Catherine was the first to speak. "Father, what is this?" Edmund gestured to the chairs. "Sit, all of you. You'll want to hear this clearly." They sat, uneasy. "My dear girls," he began, "I have devised a plan that will preserve the Rutled name for generations. It is unconventional, but necessary." As he spoke softly, persuasively, the horror unfolded. He described lineage and legacy, the danger of division through marriage, the law's betrayal of fathers without sons. Then, with the composure of a man describing crop rotation, he outlined what he called the Clearwater experiment. Each daughter would bear a child by a chosen man from the plantation. The children would carry the Rutled bloodline while remaining bound to the estate by law. The daughters froze as if the air had turned to ice. Elizabeth began to shake her head in disbelief. Margaret whispered, "You cannot be serious." Catherine rose to her feet, trembling. "Father, this is madness." Edmund didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You will comply," he said, "or you will find yourselves without inheritance, without home, and committed to the asylum at Milledgeville by Judge Ketchum's order. I have already arranged it. You have 1 week to decide whether to obey willingly or be declared unfit." He looked at each of them in turn, and in his gaze was something colder than cruelty certainty. Catherine's knees gave out, and she sat slowly, her breath shallow. Margaret's hands clenched into fists so tight her nails drew blood. Elizabeth began to cry, not loudly, but with the quiet, broken sobs of someone who realizes there is no place left to run. Outside, the sun burned high over Clearwater's fields. Samuel worked among the rows, unaware that his name had already been written in Edmund's journal as Subject Alpha. That evening, Edmund wrote in his ledger. All participants identified. Legal safeguards established. Doctors secured. Daughters informed. Commencement to begin within the fortnight. Legacy ensured. He blotted the ink carefully, folded the paper, and slid it into the false bottom of his desk. Then he sat back, exhaled slowly, and listened to the quiet hum of his house, the sound of obedience settling like dust after a storm. For Edmund Rutled, the experiment had officially begun. Sunday, June 30th. Itin Babe Wushar. The heat lay thick across Clearwater like a curse. The air in the parlor barely moved, though the windows were open and the curtains stirred faintly. Ghost-like, Catherine, Margaret, and Elizabeth sat side by side on the velvet settee, their dresses sticking to their skin, the silence between them, a living thing. When Edmund entered, he carried a folded paper in one hand and a composure so absolute it felt rehearsed. The daughters knew the stance, the posture of command. It was the same one he'd used when dismissing servants, arranging marriages for distant cousins, or deciding who lived and who left the plantation. But this time, what he was about to command would not simply alter their futures, it would erase them. Girls, he began, his voice calm, measured. I have made my decision. Catherine's fingers gripped the edge of her skirt. Margaret's jaw tightened. Elizabeth couldn't stop twisting her handkerchief. You are aware, Edmund continued, that without a male heir, this estate will be divided. Our name, our land, our legacy will scatter like chaff in the wind. I will not allow that. He set the folded paper on the mantel. This document ensures the permanence of Clearwater, a legacy that no court, no husband, no outsider can dissolve. Catherine forced herself to speak. Father, you cannot mean. I can, and I do. He cut her off with the efficiency of a blade. I have selected a man of exceptional qualities, strength, intellect, composure. His name is Samuel. You know him. Margaret's head jerked up. The field foreman. Edmund nodded. He has been chosen for a higher purpose. The silence that followed was unbearable. Catherine rose to her feet, her voice trembling but fierce. You're asking us to defile ourselves, to participate in something unspeakable. You cannot force this. Edmund's eyes hardened. I can, and I will. Each of you will produce one child. These children will carry my blood, our blood, but remain bound to this land. They will be the backbone of Clearwater's future. You should feel honored. Elizabeth began to cry, quiet tears sliding down her face. Father, please. He turned on her sharply. Enough. You will all comply. If not willingly, then under medical supervision at Milledgeville, Judge Ketchum has already prepared the papers. You will be declared unstable, hysterical, unfit to manage your own affairs. I will not have my daughters destroy the family for the sake of sentiment. Margaret's voice broke through, cold and controlled. And Samuel, does he have a choice in this? Edmund smiled faintly. Samuel is my property. He will do as commanded. In exchange, he will receive his freedom and a parcel of land. It is, I assure you, a generous arrangement. You're lying, Margaret said flatly. You never intended to free him. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The silence was admission enough. Elizabeth sobbed openly now, her small frame trembling. Catherine crossed the room and knelt beside her, whispering comfort even as her own voice shook. Margaret remained upright, rigid, eyes locked on their father with something colder than hate, a terrible clarity. You're not preserving a legacy, she said. You're building a prison. Edmund's jaw tightened. You are young and foolish. You do not see what I see. History remembers the men who act, not those who weep. He turned toward the door. You have 1 week to compose yourselves. On June 20th, the arrangements will begin. Dr. Strickland will oversee the process. Catherine whispered. The process. Edmund paused in the doorway, hand resting on the frame. Yes, he said. The Clearwater experiment. Then he left them 3 daughters sitting in the fading light, their world collapsing inward with every tick of the mantel clock. That night, the house was silent except for the low murmur of crickets and the creak of floorboards settling in the heat. In her bedroom, Catherine sat by the window, staring at the moon through the bars of the latch Edmund had ordered installed. The lock gleamed faintly, a symbol of paternal protection. He had called it. Protection from what? She wondered. Or from whom? She opened her diary, the one her mother had given her years ago, bound in blue leather and smelling faintly of lavender. On the first clean page she wrote only 4 words: God forgive us all. Then she closed it and hid it beneath the floorboard, the way frightened children hide confessions. The next morning, Edmund summoned Samuel to his study. Samuel came in cautiously, his hat in his hands, sweat beading along his temple. "Sir," he said quietly, "you asked for me." Edmund gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Sit." Samuel hesitated. Slaves did not sit in the master's study. It was an unnatural act, but Edmund insisted, and obedience was a habit formed long ago. Samuel sat, back straight, wary. "I have a proposition for you," Edmund began, "one that will secure your freedom and your future." Samuel said nothing. Edmund folded his hands on the desk. "You are a man of uncommon strength and intelligence. I've observed you for years. You've done excellent work, shown restraint and dignity, uncommon for your station. I have need of such qualities." "What kind of need?" Samuel asked. Edmund leaned back slightly. "My daughters must bear children to continue the family line. I want those children to inherit strength, discipline, intelligence. You will provide that. In return, once the children are born and weaned, you'll receive your freedom. 20 acres of land near the Tennessee border, and $500, enough to start a new life." Samuel stared, uncomprehending. "You want me to?" "Yes," Edmund said simply. "You are to father my grandchildren." The words hung between them like smoke. Samuel felt as if the floor had tilted beneath his feet. The offer was impossible, grotesque, and yet it glimmered with the one thing no enslaved man could ignore: freedom. Real, tangible freedom. The word itself was dangerous, almost holy. "Why me?" he asked finally. "Because you are exceptional," Edmund said, "and because my daughters understand their duty to this family." Samuel hesitated. "They agreed to this." Edmund met his eyes without blinking. "They did. It is their contribution to the preservation of Clearwater. You will be treated well, better quarters, better food. You'll want for nothing until your work is complete." Samuel's mind raced. He knew there was deceit here. There had to be, but the promise of freedom blazed like a beacon through the fog of doubt. The chance to own land, to live as a man rather than property. It was unthinkable. And yet, what choice did he have? Refusal was unthinkable. 2. "What if I decline?" Samuel asked quietly. Edmund's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then I'll sell you to the rice plantations in the coastal swamps. You'll work knee-deep in the water until fever takes you. Most don't last 5 years there. Choose wisely." Samuel's hands tightened around the brim of his hat. He could feel his pulse hammering in his throat. He looked at the floor, then back at his master. "I'll do it," he said. "Excellent." Edmund reached into his desk and produced a paper. "A record of our agreement. Sign here." Samuel hesitated again. "Sir, I can't." "You can write." "Samuel," Edmund said, his tone sharp, "I've seen you look at notices. Don't insult me with pretense." Samuel signed slowly, carefully, each letter trembling as he formed it. When he was done, Edmund smiled approvingly. "Very good. You've made a wise decision." But as Samuel left the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen had closed behind him, a trap disguised as opportunity. That night, Edmund added one more entry to his secret journal. Contract secured. Samuel compliant. Daughters resistant but containable. Dr. Strickland to begin preliminary examinations on June 14th. project progressing on schedule. In future generations, the name Rutled will stand unbroken. He blotted the ink, closed the journal, and placed it back in the false bottom of the desk. Outside, lightning flickered over the fields, illuminating the silhouettes of workers returning to their cabins. Among them, Samuel walked slowly, head bowed, a storm of dread rising inside him. Above, the house stood still and silent, its windows glowing faintly through the rain like watchful eyes. Inside those walls, the daughters of Edmund Rutled sat in their locked rooms, praying for deliverance that would not come. The experiment was no longer a plan. It was alive, and it had begun to breathe. The following day, June Quetazeth, Itembabe Wushar, Dr. Leonard Strickland arrived at Clearwater for what Edmund called preliminary examinations. The doctor's carriage wheels hissed over the wet clay, his hands slick on the reins. He had told himself, all the way from Augusta, that he was merely fulfilling a medical duty, that he was a witness, not an accomplice. But deep down, he already knew that line had vanished weeks ago. The housekeeper led him to the east parlor, where Catherine, Margaret, and Elizabeth waited in forced silence. Each woman looked as though she'd aged 10 years in 7 days. Catherine sat rigid, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Margaret's stare was cold, unblinking. Elizabeth trembled so visibly that Strickland's own hands began to shake in sympathy. Edmund stood by the window, back straight, eyes fixed on the horizon, as though the scene behind him were merely administrative. "Doctor," he said without turning, "you may proceed." One by one, Strickland examined them. He was gentle, more out of fear than compassion, and avoided their eyes as he performed his tasks. When Catherine asked quietly, "Is there no law to stop him?" the doctor pretended not to hear. When Margaret whispered, "Do you have daughters?" "Doctor," he nodded once, unable to answer. When Elizabeth began to cry mid-examination, he stepped back, murmured something about nervous exhaustion, and left the room to steady himself. When it was over, Strickland handed Edmund a written statement. All subjects are in sound health and capable of childbearing. He signed it with a hand that trembled only slightly. That night, as he packed his instruments, he paused at the doorway and looked back. Catherine stood near the window, framed by the light of the setting sun. She wasn't looking at him, only past him, at the far line of the fields where the horizon met the dark trees. "God forgive me," Strickland whispered, though no one heard him. Then he left Clearwater, the paper already burning a hole in his conscience. Over the next weeks, preparations began with mechanical precision. A small cottage once used for tool storage was cleared, scrubbed, and refurnished. A bed was carried in, along with clean linens, a basin, and a table lamp. To anyone asking, Edmund explained that Samuel was being rewarded for years of service, a new residence closer to the main house, a mark of favor. No one questioned him openly. At Clearwater, questions were currency you couldn't afford to spend. By the last week of June, the daughters' windows were fitted with new locks on the outside. Meals were brought to them by an older enslaved woman named Penny, who had served the family for decades. She never spoke of what she saw, but her eyes had grown so sad that even the other servants avoided meeting them. Samuel, meanwhile, was moved into the cottage. He was given better food, cleaner clothes, and told to rest. The kindness felt like a collar. At first, he didn't understand the true nature of what was coming. He thought, perhaps foolishly, that Edmund's promise of freedom meant an honorable task of some kind, maybe even teaching or managing the new fields. But then the whispers reached him that the master's daughters were ill, that the doctor came every few days, that strange papers had been signed upstairs. On the evening of July 3rd, Edmund himself came to the cottage. Samuel rose as the door opened, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Sir," he said carefully, "it's time." Edmund replied, "You will remain here tonight. My eldest daughter, Catherine, will join you shortly. Treat her with respect. And remember, your future depends on her cooperation." Samuel froze. "Sir, I don't understand." Edmund's expression darkened. You understand perfectly. This is your duty. You will be rewarded as promised. Do as I say, and all will go smoothly. Resist, and your freedom becomes a fantasy you'll never live to see. He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. There will be a man stationed outside, for everyone's protection. The door closed. The key turned. A few minutes later, footsteps approached outside light. Hesitant, the door opened again, and Catherine stepped inside. Her face was pale but calm, her eyes rimmed red from sleeplessness. Samuel took a step back as though he'd seen an apparition. Neither spoke for several seconds. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Catherine finally said, "He promised you freedom, didn't he?" Samuel's throat tightened. "Yes, ma'am." Her lips trembled, but she nodded. "Then let us both do what we must and survive it." He wanted to say something, anything, to make it less unbearable, but there were no words big enough to fill the silence between them. Edmund's overseer, Virgil Haskell, stood outside the door with a pistol in his belt and a lantern by his boots. His orders were simple: no one leaves. No one interferes. Inside, the lamp burned low through the night. No one screamed. Only once did Catherine's voice break the stillness, whispering, "God forgive us." So quietly it might have been the wind. For 3 nights, Edmund repeated the ritual. On July 10th, it was Margaret's turn. On the 17th, Elizabeth's. Each was escorted to the cottage by Edmund himself. Each returned before dawn, silent and hollow-eyed. Dr. Strickland made his weekly visits, recording routine health examinations. He noted elevated pulse rates, fainting spells, nausea, all written clinically, as though it were any other pregnancy under his care. To the neighbors, Edmund explained that his daughters were delicate and required rest. He stopped attending church, citing family illness. When visitors came to the plantation, they were told the women were recovering from an epidemic of influenza. The lie spread easily. Lies, like weeds, thrive in rich soil. By August, the worst of the summer heat had broken. The fields shimmered with the silver-white bloom of cotton, and Clearwater seemed, from a distance, a picture of order. But inside the house, the air was heavy with dread. Catherine no longer left her room. Margaret's defiance had curdled into quiet rage. Elizabeth spent hours painting the same image over and over a riverbank, with a cottage in the distance, half in shadow. On September 2nd, Dr. Strickland confirmed what Edmund had been waiting to hear. All 3 daughters were pregnant. He handed Edmund the report, signed and sealed. Edmund read it, nodded once, and said simply, "Good. The experiment has succeeded." Strickland felt bile rise in his throat. "Succeeded," he repeated. "They're your daughters. For God's sake." "They are the vessels of progress," Edmund said coolly. "And God, if he disapproves, has been strangely silent." That night, he ordered the second-floor windows nailed shut from the outside. Penny was instructed to bring the daughters' meals upstairs and to let no one else see them. Letters were forbidden. All visits ceased. To the world, the Rutled daughters had vanished into seclusion. To Clearwater, they had become living experiments. Samuel was returned to his work in the fields. He tried not to meet anyone's eyes. He tried not to hear the whispers. But every night, when he passed the cottage on his way back to his quarters, he saw the lamp burning in the window and felt the memory of Catherine's whisper echo inside him. "God forgive us." He began to pray again, not for freedom, but for an ending. As September deepened, the plantation slipped into a grim routine. Edmund wrote in his journal with the precision of a scientist. Subjects display normal symptoms. Emotional instability present but manageable. Doctor consistent. Overseer reliable. Samuel compliant. All variables controlled. He never called them daughters, only subjects. He had achieved what he believed was brilliance, total control, sealed within his estate like a living equation. What he didn't know, what no one yet realized, was that control is always an illusion, and that outside Clearwater, a man named Sheriff Thomas Brennan was about to arrive in Hancock County, and his first question, casual and almost harmless, would be the one to unravel everything. By the time the autumn sun began to fade over the fields, Clearwater's shadow had already stretched far beyond its gates. The house remained quiet, the daughters unseen, and Samuel, a man promised freedom, became a ghost among the living. The lamp in the cottage still burned some nights, though no one entered anymore. Some said Edmund left it lit to remind himself that history was watching. Others whispered that it was Catherine's spirit, refusing to let darkness finish what daylight began. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: the Clearwater experiment had reached its midpoint, and from here on, every secret would have a witness. By October of 1852, Clearwater Plantation had become a world unto itself, sealed, silent, and surrounded by whispers. The fields still thrummed with the rhythm of harvest. Cotton wagons creaked down the road to Sparta, but among the people of Hancock County, conversation had begun to twist like smoke. It started in the marketplace. A merchant's wife said she hadn't seen the Rutled girls since early summer. A preacher's wife remarked that their pew at church had remained empty for months. Someone else swore they'd seen shutters nailed shut on the second floor of Clearwater. And then came the story that traveled fastest of all: the daughters were ill, terribly ill, and their father wouldn't allow a soul near them. It would have ended there. A curiosity swallowed by polite silence. Had a new sheriff not arrived in Sparta that same autumn? His name was Thomas Brennan. Brennan was 34, young for his post, but with the tired eyes of a man who had seen too much war. He had fought in Mexico, returned with a bullet scar under his left shoulder, and a conviction that authority should serve justice, not the other way around. He had no wife, nor children, and no patience for the complacent corruption that passed for law in most of Georgia's plantation counties. When he took his oath in September, the local magistrate congratulated him with a half-smile that meant, "Keep the peace, but don't stir the water." Brennan nodded. He had no intention of stirring anything until the water turned foul on its own. His first weeks were uneventful. He toured the county, introduced himself to farmers and merchants, and quietly read the backlog of warrants left neglected by his predecessor. He noticed patterns, names that appeared too often on property disputes, judges who ruled in favor of the same planters again and again. One name surfaced more than any other: Edmund Rutled. It wasn't unusual. Rutled was one of the wealthiest men in the county, but there was something about the frequency, the quiet influence behind each ruling, that made Brennan take note. Then, one night in late September, while sharing a drink with a local merchant named Hosea Grafton, he heard the rumor that changed everything. Grafton leaned closer over his ale. "Strangest thing. Sheriff, you heard about old Rutled's daughters?" "No," Brennan said. "What about them? All three took sick at once back in June. Haven't been seen since. Whole house shut up tighter than a coffin. He says it's female trouble, delicate and private, but I don't buy it. Healthy girls, the lot of them. You can't hide sickness that long unless it's something you don't want anyone seeing." Brennan's expression didn't change, but the information lodged itself like a splinter. He'd seen the kind of silence that grows around a lie. In early October, he met Dr. Strickland by chance at the courthouse. Strickland had come to file routine death certificates. 2 enslaved workers from a neighboring plantation had died of fever, but the doctor's demeanor was off-sweating despite the cool weather. Eyes darting like a trapped animal's. "Doctor," Brennan greeted, his tone neutral. "I hear you tend to Clearwater's affairs." Strickland froze for a fraction of a second. "Occasionally, yes. Routine matters. How are the Rutled daughters? I hear they've been unwell." The doctor's hand twitched as he adjusted his hat. "Ah, yes. A lingering illness. Nothing contagious. Private matters. You understand?" "Of course," Brennan said, letting the silence stretch. "I imagine their father spares no expense." "Indeed," Strickland muttered, and made his exit so quickly he forgot his walking stick by the clerk's desk. Brennan picked it up and turned it over in his hands. The initials L.S. were carved into the handle, neat, professional, perfectly ordinary. Still, he kept it. That night, he began asking questions. In taverns, in post offices, in the pews after Sunday service. He listened. The story was the same. The Rutled girls had disappeared behind the plantation's walls. Neighbors had been turned away at the gate. Even the preacher had been told to stay away. That their condition required isolation. No one, not even the enslaved workers, had seen them in months. Brennan visited Clearwater on November Colmerd, under the pretense of investigating a runaway fugitive. The approach was breathtaking, a mile-long avenue of oaks, their branches intertwining above the red road like ribs enclosing a heart. The plantation house rose at the end, white columns gleaming, the front lawn manicured to perfection. It looked, Brennan thought, like a photograph of civility built over a grave. He was met by the overseer, Thaddeus Porter, a thick man with small eyes and a voice practiced in false politeness. "Morning, Sheriff. What brings you out this way, chasing a rumor?" Brennan said. "A fugitive was spotted near here last week. Thought I'd check the outbuildings." Porter shook his head. "No fugitives here. Sire, Mr. Rutled keeps a strict order. I'll speak to him directly, if he's available. I'm afraid the master's occupied with family concerns." Brennan's tone didn't change. "Nothing serious. I hope his daughters are ill," Porter said. "Requires his full attention. I'd like to pay my respects." "That won't be necessary," Porter replied too quickly. "Mr. Rutled values his privacy." Brennan smiled faintly. "I found privacy tends to value men right back." He rode away, appearing satisfied, but circled through the woods east of the property. From a rise overlooking the creek, he watched the plantation for an hour. Smoke rose from the kitchen house. Field hands moved like shadows between the rows. Everything looked ordinary, except for one small detail. Near the main house stood a separate cottage, its chimney thinly smoking. A man stood outside, motionless, almost as if posted. Brennan lifted his spyglass. The man wasn't working. He was waiting. He made a note in his ledger, "Unidentified male, stationed by cottage likely guard." That evening, Brennan returned to Sparta and went straight to the county records office. The clerks had long since gone home, so he unlocked the door with the key entrusted to him and lit a single oil lamp. He spent the next 3 hours combing through property deeds, court records, and tax documents bearing the name Edmund Rutled. The paper trail told a story cold and methodical. Over the past decade, Rutled had absorbed 3 neighboring farms through foreclosure. All with Judge Ketchum presiding. He'd purchased additional enslaved workers, mostly men, each transaction recorded with surgical precision. But one record stopped Brennan cold. It was a property transfer dated September 10th, 1,852 20 acres of land near the Tennessee border, signed by Edmund Rutled, deeded to a man named Samuel Friedman, conditional upon fulfillment of agreed terms. The witness, Judge Horace Ketchum. A transfer of land to a slave, conditional. It made no sense, and yet it made too much sense. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the flickering lamp. A judge, a doctor, and a man like Rutled that was a triangle built for hiding something vile. The next morning, Brennan visited a farmer whose property bordered Clearwater. Amos Pruitt was a quiet man, the kind who spoke little and remembered everything. When Brennan mentioned the plantation, Pruitt shifted uneasily. "Don't want no trouble with that man." "Sheriff, I'm not looking for trouble," Brennan said. "I'm looking for truth." The farmer hesitated. Then sighed. "Late October. I was hunting near the line fence. Down by the swamp, heard a scream. A woman's voice. Not like any field hand I've ever heard, refined, educated. Came from the big house direction. Stopped quick. Didn't go closer. Figured it wasn't my business. Do you think it was one of the daughters?" Pruitt swallowed. "Can't say for sure. but I haven't heard church bells from Clearwater since Easter." Brennan nodded, thanked him, and rode back to town with a heaviness pressing on his chest. He'd seen darkness in war men reduced to animals in the name of victory, but this was something else. This was refinement turned rotten, civilization dressed over savagery. The first real crack in the wall came at the Saturday market. He saw an elderly black woman selling eggs, her hands trembling with age. He overheard another vendor mention she worked at Clearwater. Brennan waited until the crowd thinned and approached her. "Those eggs look fresh," he said. "Yes." "Zoo," she replied softly. "I'll take a dozen." He handed her the coins, then lowered his voice. "I'm the sheriff. You're from Clearwater." Her hands froze for the smallest moment. "Yesu." "House servant." "Are the young ladies still alive?" The pause was barely perceptible, but when she looked up, her eyes were wet. "They alive?" she whispered. "Are they being hurt?" She looked over her shoulder, then leaned closer as she placed the eggs in his basket. "Samuel's cottage," she said. "Nights." Then she straightened, smiled shakily, and called to another customer, her voice suddenly loud. "Fresh eggs, 6 cents a dozen." Brennan walked away, heart pounding, the words echoing in his head. Samuel's cottage. Nights. He knew then that whatever was happening at Clearwater was no illness, no delicate condition. It was something monstrous, something born of power, secrecy, and the belief that law itself could be rewritten by those who owned enough of it. And though he didn't yet know how deep the roots went, Thomas Brennan made a quiet vow as he mounted his horse and looked back toward the plantation road. Glowing pale in the autumn light, he would dig until he found them. For the rest of that autumn, Sheriff Thomas Brennan could think of little else. Every night, he sat by the oil lamp in his office, reading through his notes, crossing and recrossing names, matching dates, drawing lines between men who all seemed to owe favors to Edmund Rutled. The judge, the doctor, the mysterious property deed, and now, the whispered phrase from that old servant Samuel's cottage. Nights. It wasn't proof, but it was direction. And Brennan had learned long ago that direction is where justice begins. They started quietly. A good sheriff in the South understood that information was more fragile than porcelain. You had to touch it gently, or it shattered. So Brennan moved like a man rearranging small pieces of a puzzle while pretending to sweep the table. He visited the county bank under the pretense of auditing old bonds and quietly asked to see records of Edmund Rutled's recent transactions. Nothing unusual at first: farm equipment, shipment payment, medical fees. But in May, 2 large withdrawals appeared, one to Dr. Leonard Strickland for medical consultation, and another to Judge Horace Ketchum for legal services rendered. Both amounts were identical, $500 each. A suspiciously tidy symmetry. Then came September, a third payment, this one to the Augusta Credit Union covering, as Brennan later confirmed, Strickland's entire gambling debt. A doctor in debt, suddenly solvent, a judge receiving unexplained legal fees, and an influential man with 3 vanished daughters. The arithmetic of evil was beginning to balance. In late November, Brennan returned to Clearwater, not openly this time. He left his horse tied a mile from the house and followed the creek that skirted the eastern field. The air was sharp with the smell of ash. The last cotton fires had just burned out. The plantation at night looked both alive and dead, lamp glow flickering from the main house windows, while the fields beyond lay in total blackness. He crept close enough to see movement in the yard. A woman older, limping, crossed from the kitchen house carrying a tray. She climbed the steps to the 2nd floor and disappeared through a door that Brennan realized had an exterior lock. Another door beside it, also bolted from the outside. He counted 3 in total, each shuttered, each with a bolt gleaming in the lamplight. Then he saw something else. Samuel. The man was walking slowly from the barn toward a small cottage near the house, the same one Brennan had seen from the hill weeks earlier. Samuel's shoulders were bowed, his gait heavy. The overseer, Virgil Haskell, followed 10 paces behind, carrying a lantern and a rifle. The image was clear: a man under watch, not reward. Brennan waited until they disappeared into the shadows, then slipped back toward the woods. The wind rustled through the reeds by the creek, whispering through the cold air like a voice trying to speak. He understood, now more than ever, that something unspeakable was happening behind those whitewashed walls. But to stop it, he'd need witnesses, and the only people who could tell the truth were either enslaved or imprisoned in that house. A few days later, Brennan rode to Milledgeville to consult state law records. He needed to know what Edmund could legally do under Georgia's inheritance statutes. What he found chilled him. A father could, under certain conditions, declare his unmarried daughters incompetent and place them under judicial guardianship. The process required only a judge's approval, and Judge Ketchum had signed every such order in Hancock County for 30 years. If Edmund decided to silence his daughters, all he needed was that signature. Brennan rode back through the night, arriving in Sparta near dawn, exhausted but certain of one thing: if he waited, the Rutled daughters would disappear, not just from sight, but from law itself. He had to act soon. The first step was finding someone inside Clearwater who would talk. He couldn't question the daughters directly, and Samuel was being watched too closely. But maybe, just maybe, the doctor could be cracked. He began by learning Strickland's patterns. The doctor came to Clearwater every Thursday, stayed for several hours, then returned to his home in Augusta the following morning. Brennan made note of the time, the route, and most importantly, the fact that Strickland traveled alone. On December 2nd, he intercepted him. The carriage rattled over a narrow stretch of road just outside Sparta when Brennan stepped out from the trees, holding his badge in one hand and his revolver in the other. "Evening, Doctor," he said calmly. "We need to talk." Strickland startled so violently, the reins slipped from his fingers. "Sheriff, what on earth? Relax. You're not under arrest. Yet." Brennan climbed into the carriage beside him, closing the door behind them. "I know you've been working for Edmund Rutled. I know you've been visiting that house every week for 6 months. And I know you've been paid more money than any plantation doctor in this county earns in a year. So tell me, Doctor, what are you being paid to keep quiet about?" Strickland's face went pale. "I can't, you can," Brennan interrupted. "Or you can answer those questions in front of a grand jury." The doctor looked away, his voice low. "You don't understand. He owns everything half this county. The judges, the bank. If I speak, I'm finished. If you don't speak, others will be finished." Brennan said, "His daughters, the man he's using for this, whatever it is." Strickland flinched. Brennan leaned forward. "You see, Doctor, I'm not guessing anymore. I know about Samuel. I know about the land deed. I know about Judge Ketchum. I just need one person, one decent man to confirm it." The carriage jolted over a rut. Strickland's hands trembled on his knees. "Finally," he whispered, "he calls it an experiment." Brennan held his breath. "Go on. He believes he can improve his bloodline. He forced them. His daughters. He made me examine them, certify their health. He paid me to keep records that said everything was voluntary. Healthy. Controlled. But it wasn't. None of it was." Samuel, Brennan asked. Strickland nodded, eyes full of shame. "He promised the man freedom, land, lies, all of it. He'll never let him go." Brennan felt the world tilt. He'd suspected horror, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. He reached for his notebook. "You're going to write this down, everything. Then you're going to sign it." Strickland's hands shook. "If I do, he'll kill me. If you don't, I'll make sure you hang beside him." Brennan said coldly, "Now, which do you prefer?" It took 3 hours, but when it was done, Brennan held the first piece of written truth, a sworn statement by a licensed physician describing the Clearwater experiment. It was enough to start a war, and he intended to. The next day, he rode to Milledgeville and placed the document directly in the hands of Attorney General Harrison Vance. Vance read in silence, his face growing graver with each page. "My God," he muttered, "if this is true, It's not just criminal, it's treason against every moral principle this state pretends to hold. Brennan nodded. I'll need warrants for Rutled, Ketchum, and anyone assisting them, and I'll need protection for the daughters and the man he's using, Samuel. You'll have them, Vance said, but we'll have to move carefully. If any of them gets wind of this before we act, they'll destroy the evidence and the witnesses. They agreed to coordinate the arrests for December 27th, 3 weeks. Brennan hated the delay, but he understood. It would take time to prepare the warrants, to organize marshals, to make it airtight. He returned to Sparta, carrying Strickland's confession locked in his saddlebag. He didn't see the pair of eyes watching him from across the courthouse square, the thin, nervous clerk who sometimes ran errands for Judge Ketchum. That man would later ride to Clearwater and sell everything he'd overheard for $200. For now, Brennan thought he had time. He spent the following nights reviewing his plans, cross-checking each name, each witness, each document. Every fact felt like a brick in a wall, strong enough to finally corner a man who'd built his life on escaping consequence. He didn't know that while he built that wall, Edmund Rutled was building something darker, a counterweight designed to crush anyone who tried to stand against him. And as Christmas approached, with frost creeping along the windows of Clearwater, the plantation's secrets began to hum like a wire pulled too tight, waiting for the first spark to make it snap. December 1852 arrived cold and colorless. Frost silvered the cotton fields. The air smelled faintly of ash and winter rain. In the distance, the chimneys of Clearwater rose above the grey mist like tombstones of a world that refused to die. Inside that house, time had frozen. Catherine, Margaret, and Elizabeth remained locked in their rooms. Their bellies had begun to swell, proof of what Edmund called success. They rarely spoke now, except to pray quietly. Separately, each in her own cell of grief, Samuel still lived in the small cottage near the creek, neither slave nor free, shunned by the others, haunted by what he'd been forced to do. Each night, he sat by the lamp's weak flame and whispered a name he barely dared say aloud: Catherine. He didn't know if she hated him, pitied him, or both, but he knew she was suffering, and so was he. In Milledgeville, Sheriff Thomas Brennan had everything ready: Strickland's confession, the land deed, the testimony from the old servant, all now in the hands of the state attorney general, Harrison Vance. 3 state marshals would ride with Brennan at dawn on December 27th. Their orders were clear: arrest Edmund Rutled and Judge Horace Ketchum, place the daughters under protective custody, and remove all incriminating documents from Clearwater before Edmund could destroy them. It should have worked. It would have worked had no one warned Edmund first. On the night of December 26th, a knock sounded at Clearwater's door. Virgil Haskell, the overseer, opened it to find a thin man in a government clerk's coat. Mud splattered on his boots. His name was Wallace Dunor, a minor clerk from the Attorney General's office, the kind of man who thought loyalty was worth less than money. I came to speak to Mr. Brewer. Rutled, Dunor said breathlessly. It's urgent. He was led to the study, where Edmund sat beneath the oil lamp, writing in his journal. He didn't look up until the clerk laid a folded letter on his desk. What is this, warrants? Dunor whispered. They'll be here at dawn. Sheriff Brennan, he's coming with marshals from Milledgeville. He knows everything. The doctor talked. Edmund's face remained composed, but his pulse quickened. How do you know this? I saw the papers myself. Dunore said, arrest warrants for you and Judge Ketchum. Protective orders for your daughters. They plan to search the house, confiscate your records. He swallowed. I thought you should know. For a price. Edmund rose, opened a drawer, and pulled out a small box. Inside was a bundle of bills. $200. He said, you will take this and never speak of tonight again. Dunor snatched the money, nodded quickly, and fled into the darkness. When the door closed, Edmund stood perfectly still. Then he extinguished the lamp, his mind already calculating. He couldn't run the roads, would be watched. He couldn't bribe the state, but he could control the narrative. If he couldn't bury the truth, he would poison it. He sent for Judge Ketchum first. The old man arrived within the hour, shivering in his greatcoat. "Edmund," Ketchum said, his voice trembling. "What is this about an arrest? An unfortunate misunderstanding?" Edmund replied coolly, "But one we can still correct if we act swiftly." He explained the plan with unnerving calm. They would file paperwork declaring the daughters mentally incompetent, backdated to before the investigation began. That would render their testimony legally invalid. If anyone came to remove them, Edmund would present the documents as proof they were unfit to testify. The law would protect him at least long enough to rewrite the story. And the slave Ketchum asked. Samuel Edmund's eyes hardened. "He will not live to testify." The judge hesitated. "Murder will only make things worse." "Murder," Edmund smiled thinly. "No. Tragedy. The man will attempt escape tonight. He will drown in the creek." Ketchum looked sick, but he nodded. He had gone too far to turn back now. Within the hour, he left Clearwater with the forged documents, promising to file them before dawn. Edmund watched him go, then turned to his overseer. "Virgil," he said softly, "fetch Samuel." The night was black, moonless, and windless, the kind of silence that feels like the world is holding its breath. Samuel followed Haskell and 2 other men through the fields, his wrists bound. "Master wants to see me," he asked, voice low. "That's right," Haskell said. "Why, at the creek, you'll see." When they reached the water's edge, Samuel understood. He tried to run, but Haskell's men were faster. They tackled him, drove him into the mud, forced his face into the icy current. He fought, twisting, kicking, grabbing handfuls of river grass as his lungs burned. In the blur of panic, one thought flashed in his mind: Catherine, her voice, her tears, her whispered prayer. The water roared in his ears. Then gunfire. A single shot split the night. Then another. Haskell's grip slackened. Samuel surfaced, coughing, gasping for air, and saw figures on horseback charging from the trees. Lanterns flared. Gunsmoke bloomed. "Sheriff," one of the men shouted. Brennan rode ahead, his arm still in a sling, his revolver blazing. 2 of Haskell's men dropped their weapons and fled. One fell screaming into the water. Samuel staggered to the bank, coughing blood. Brennan jumped down, splashing through the creek to pull him out. "You all right?" he asked. Samuel nodded weakly. "We're ending this," Brennan said. "Tonight." They rode hard toward the house. The front doors of Clearwater were bolted shut, but Brennan's men broke them down with axes. Inside, Edmund stood in his study, calmly waiting as if he had known they would come. "Sheriff," he said smoothly, "this is an illegal intrusion. You have no authority here. You're under arrest." Brennan said, "Conspiracy, false imprisonment, and attempted murder." "Where are your daughters?" Edmund's eyes glinted. "They are ill. Judge Ketchum has already filed their guardianship papers. They cannot be questioned. Those orders are void." Brennan snapped. "Where are they?" From behind him, Samuel spoke hoarsely. "Second floor. East wing. Locked rooms." Edmund's composure cracked for the first time. "You have no right," he hissed. "I have a duty," Brennan replied. "And you have a cell waiting in Milledgeville." 2 men restrained Edmund, while Brennan and Samuel rushed upstairs. The first door they opened revealed Catherine pale, exhausted, but alive. She looked up at them with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Are you here to help us?" she whispered. "Yes," Brennan said. "You're safe now." Margaret and Elizabeth were found in the next rooms, weak but breathing, each clutching a rosary. When Brennan told them their father was under arrest, all 3 began to weep, not with sorrow, but with a relief so fierce it shook the walls. The arrests that followed shook all of Georgia. Judge Ketchum was seized the next morning. Dr. Strickland surrendered himself and agreed to testify. For the first time in the state's history, a white planter was charged with crimes against his own family. The trial began in February 1853. Reporters called it the case of the Clearwater daughters. Crowds filled the courthouse. Some came to see justice, others came to defend the sanctity of power. Brennan testified first, then Strickland, pale and trembling, described every detail: the false medical records, the forced pregnancies, the forged documents. Finally, Catherine, Margaret, and Elizabeth took the stand. Their voices broke as they told the jury what their father had done. But they did not falter. When Catherine finished her testimony, the courtroom sat in silence. No applause, no gasps, just a collective recognition of something unspeakable finally spoken aloud. The verdict came 9 days later: guilty of conspiracy and false imprisonment. 12 years imprisonment. The crowd was divided. Some cheered, others left in disgust, muttering that a father had been punished for protecting his legacy. Edmund Rutled showed no emotion as the sentence was read. Only once, as he was led from the courtroom, did he speak to Brennan. "You think you've destroyed me," he said quietly, "but I've already ensured my legacy lives on. Through them." Brennan stared back. "You don't have a legacy. You have a curse." Clearwater was abandoned soon after. The daughters sold it, moved north, and raised their children together in Charleston. Samuel was granted freedom, a small piece of land, and a quiet life in Ohio. He never married. The daughters never returned to Georgia. They named their children after the people who saved them: Thomas, Hope, and Samuel. Years later, the house burned to the ground. No one rebuilt it. Locals said the fire started by lightning. Others whispered that Catherine herself had returned one last time and set it ablaze. Whatever the truth, the land remains silent now. Only the creek still runs where Samuel almost died, its water dark and slow, whispering the story no monument ever could. And in the end, Sheriff Brennan's report to the state attorney contained a single line that history would later quote again and again: "Evil does not always wear chains. Sometimes it wears inheritance rings." The trial of the Clearwater daughters reverberated across Georgia like thunder rolling over distant hills. Newspapers from Savannah to Charleston printed headlines dripping with disbelief. Planter sentenced for family experiment, judge implicated in horrid conspiracy, daughters bear children of their father's design. But behind those words, behind the ink and outrage, there lingered a silence that no printing press could break: the silence of 3 young women trying to live in a world that could never forget what had been done to them. Edmund Rutled was taken to the Milledgeville State Penitentiary, a place where the walls sweated in summer and the rats grew fat on grain meant for prisoners. Even there, he carried himself like a gentleman among beasts. He lectured guards on lineage and discipline, spoke proudly of genetic progress, and wrote letters to lawmakers proposing hereditary reform in plantation management. Most went unanswered. The few that didn't were returned unopened. When pneumonia claimed him in 1859, the prison chaplain found his final entry in a leather-bound journal: "The world misunderstood me. I sought perfection, and they called it sin. But blood remembers purpose." He was buried in an unmarked grave behind the prison wall. No one came to claim his body. No one spoke his name again in Hancock County. Judge Horace Ketchum fared little better. His reputation collapsed the moment Dr. Strickland's signed testimony was read aloud in court. Decades of rulings, once seen as pillars of Georgia law, were suddenly re-examined under the shadow of corruption. He served 8 years, died within 2 of release, and left behind a single surviving letter in which he wrote, "We all thought ourselves architects of stability. We were, in truth, the scaffolding of madness." His name was quietly erased from courthouse plaques, but whispers about the judge's complicity became the kind of ghost story fathers told their sons when warning them about ambition without conscience. Dr. Leonard Strickland vanished from public life. He escaped imprisonment through cooperation, but lost his medical license, his fortune, and his reputation. He moved west, settling under a false name near Mobile, Alabama. Locals remembered him as a pale, anxious man who spent his evenings staring at the horizon. as if waiting for something to find him. He died in 1865 alone, during a yellow fever outbreak, still carrying a single folded document in his pocket, Catherine's first written statement. It was worn smooth at the edges, like something handled too often to forget. And what of those left to bear the weight of Edmund's legacy? Catherine, Margaret, and Elizabeth left Georgia within months of the trial's end. They traveled north under assumed names, eventually settling in Charleston, South Carolina, one of the few cities where mixed ancestry could pass unnoticed if no one asked too many questions. There, the three women raised their children together in a modest townhouse near the harbor. The neighbors called them the Sisters from Savannah, never suspecting what those soft-spoken women carried in their past. Catherine's son, Edmund Rutled, grew into a thoughtful, quiet man with his mother's eyes and Samuel's resilience. He became a teacher, one of the few biracial educators permitted to work openly after the war. His classroom was small, but he filled it with books that told truths his grandfather tried to erase. On the wall behind his desk, he hung a single phrase written in chalk: "Knowledge is the freedom they can never revoke." Margaret's daughter, Hope, lived up to her name. She inherited her mother's determination and her father's strength. In adulthood, she married a free black merchant from Philadelphia, and together they opened a small print shop. The sign above the door read Rutled and Hope Press. Iten Babe Tijar. They published pamphlets about equality and education, works banned in parts of the South. When asked once why she risked it, Hope replied, "Because my mother's silence built prisons, my voice will build exits." Elizabeth's son, Samuel Jr., became a minister. He never used the name Rutled publicly, only Samuel Freeman. His sermons spoke of redemption, but always carried an undertone of warning. There is no virtue in blood, only in choice. Lineage is not salvation, it is a test. He spent his later years helping escaped slaves build communities across Ohio and Indiana, leaving behind letters that historians would later call the conscience of Reconstruction. Sheriff Thomas Brennan lived to see their stories fade into the dust of history. After the Rutled trial, he served another decade in Hancock County, quietly dismantling the old networks of corruption that had allowed men like Edmund to thrive. When he finally retired, he refused offers of promotion and politics, saying only, "I've spent enough time in rooms where justice had a price." He died in 1874, buried with no fanfare beside his wife, whom he married late in life, and his gravestone bore a single inscription: "He listened when no one else would." In the Georgia State Archives, his handwritten report still exists, sealed in a fragile leather folder. The last page carries a note not meant for any superior officer, but for whoever would read it in the future. "I've seen men justify anything by calling it progress breeding, ownership, war. They always forget that the moment you decide who deserves to be human, you've already become less than one yourself." Years turned into decades. The ruins of Clearwater were reclaimed by Pine and Kudzu. Children in Hancock County grew up hearing the ghost story of the house that bred itself. They said that on humid nights, you could hear the cries of women behind the nailed shutters, or see a faint light flickering where the cottage once stood. Most dismissed it as superstition. But one winter evening in 1891, when an old man named Samuel Freeman lay dying in Ohio, his neighbors claimed they saw him reach out towards something only he could see. When asked what he was looking at, he whispered, "The water's clear again." He died smiling. Today, Clearwater exists only in fragments, court transcripts, faded letters, yellowed newspaper clippings. The official history remembers it as a scandal, not a tragedy. But if you walk the land where the creek still winds through the Georgia clay, locals will tell you that the ground feels heavier there, as if it remembers. And perhaps that's the truest legacy of Edmund Rutled, not in the bloodlines he tried to control, but in the soil that refused to forget. Because some stories, no matter how buried, keep breathing through the land that bore witness. And sometimes, late at night, the wind along the creek still whispers a name that history tried to erase: Catherine.